Thank you, everybody, and welcome to Pathways to Prosperity. We're kind of going from the general to the more particular in this presentation, and I'm going to start with the most general and abstruse question around the crisis of our times, but probably one of the more pressing ones, which is why is this happening? Why do we have so much what we politely call anti-immigration politics, which I would say more broadly is a politics of racial intolerance, being successful, being voted for in many countries around the world? And I think there are a number of ways to ask that question and pose it, but I'm going to ask it one way by asking, is anti-immigration politics, is people voting for anti-immigration politics a response to immigration? Because there certainly are people who say this, who say, okay, when you have a bunch of immigration, people don't like it, and they vote for anti-immigration parties, and that's it. And I would say we don't have a clear answer to that question, but it's more complicated than that. And the way I think it's best to examine this is to look at a bunch of maps. So what we're going to be doing for the next 15 minutes is looking at a whole lot of maps. I hope we have lots of cardophiliacs in this room, not so many cardophobics. And let me start here in Germany. And this is a map of Germany, and it's a map specifically showing what percentage of people voted for the AfD party, Alternative for Deutschland party, which is it's an extreme anti-immigration party. I would say a much more broadly party of racial intolerance. They don't seem to like people with darker skin or other religions, whether or not they're immigrants. But they're virtually a single issue party. This is the most recent German election, and the darker colors are places where the party received enough votes to become the mainstream party, either the largest party or the second largest party. The lighter colored ones, they get 10 or 15% of the vote generally, still a little bit alarming, given that a party of that sort has not had political standing in Germany since the Second World War. But what we see, of course, is a really stark dividing line between places where a lot of people voted for that party and places where some people voted for that party. And a couple things about that borderline there that you may notice. First of all, it is almost exactly the old borderline between the GDR and the Federal Republic of Germany. It's the Iron Curtain. It's the East and West Germany line. The former communist places overwhelmingly voted for this party of intolerance, and the former West didn't, even 30 years after the fall of that divide. But there's a second thing about that dividing line that's interesting, and let me switch to another map of Germany, which looks similar. This is a map of how many people aren't immigrants. The dark blue are places where 95% of the population are people not of what they call people of immigration descent in Germany. That is, people who were born in another country or whose parents were born in another country. So fewer than 5% of the population in those very deep blue places are of immigration descent. In other words, and that little blue circle in the middle of, light blue circle in the middle of that is Berlin. So the places where people voted for the anti-immigration party are the places where there are almost no immigrants. Germany is sort of an illustration of, here we can flip back and forth between them, see? Germany is an interesting illustration of what sometimes gets called the contact theory, which you may have heard of, which is one explanatory factor, which is the idea that people who live among immigrants or among diverse populations don't vote for parties opposed to immigration or diversity. That contact with diversity does it. It's people, we used to have the expression anti-Semitism without Jews. The places in Europe that have the strongest anti-Semitism are places where nobody's ever encountered anybody who's Jewish. And that is one of the several hypotheses for these phenomena. If we look at some other countries, this is France. And this is a map of where the immigrants live in France, or where foreign-born people live in France. As you can see, the Ile-de-France, the area around Paris, has very high proportion, in fact, the lion's share of people foreign-born, and then along the southern border and along the border, the eastern borders. And this is a map of who voted for Marine Le Pen in yellow, and who voted for Emmanuel Macron in blue for president. And it's not a complete inversion the way it is in Germany. Certainly if you look in the Paris area, it does look like a complete inversion. But there are some exceptions. The area around Marseille in the south is a lot of people did vote for Le Pen, and it is a place with a lot of immigrants. Although if you zoom in closely on that area, you find it varies from electoral district to electoral district, with a lot of very strongly Macron districts and a lot of very strongly Le Pen districts, and that sometimes follows ethnic and national patterns. A lot of all-white areas voted for Le Pen that were adjoining more diverse areas that voted for Macron. And that some would say that that area around Marseille is an example of another theory which is called the halo theory, which is that people in mainly white or non-immigrant districts that are adjoining to very diverse districts tend to vote for anti-immigration politics. In other words, they say, we're fine here, but look over there, I don't want it to be like that. I'm going to vote for these guys. There are areas that seem to support that. As I would say that Germany provides a counter-argument to that. It's not the people in those adjoining areas that do, but that's two of the theories, and we'll talk about a third later. This is Poland. In blue is the presidential, the candidate for PIS party, which is a far-right anti-Europe, anti-immigration party, and in the orange is the Civic Forum candidate, which is a more liberal, pro-European, pro-immigration party. And again, we see this stark divide between East and West, but also we see in the major cities, we have people voting for the more liberal parties. And again, in Poland, if you're going to encounter foreign-born people or visible minorities and so on, it's going to be in the major urban areas. It's going to be in Warsaw and Gdansk and Wrocław and places like that. And in those places, they are not voting for the anti-immigration parties. I mean, it's kind of interesting that the western part of Poland, on the left there, is voting the most liberal, the most pro-immigration. And as soon as you cross the Oder River there into the far eastern part of Germany, you get the most dramatically anti-immigration voting and so on. It's not following geographic boundaries, it's following national and political boundaries. It also says something about the variegated patterns of post-communist transition and progress in Central Europe. Let's go to Texas for a moment, shall we? And this is how people voted in the very recent election. The United States being backwards in this sense, the blue is the Democrats and the red is the Republicans. I don't understand why the Americans do the opposite colors of everyone else in the world, but as we can see, the places adjoining, I mean, and it's very safe to say that in this election, the Democrats, certainly in that state, were generally favorable toward immigration, and the Republicans were very dramatically against it. And you see the areas adjoining the border, you know, where the wall's going to be built to stop all those Mexicans from throwing their bags of drugs across and all that sort of thing, and voted very strongly for the Democrats. Let's look at that other map of Texas. This is where foreign-born people live in Texas. The darker color is more than 20% foreign-born population. Let's just go back and forth again. So those places along the border are where there's a heavy immigrant population, and of course in the big cities. And once again, we see where there's a lot of immigration, people are not voting for anti-immigration parties. I should note as well, this effect is not caused by the immigrants within these areas voting for the more pro-immigration parties. Even if you adjust for that, the white people in these areas, whether in Germany or France or Poland or what have you, are also voting overwhelmingly for. So in other words, it's not caused by the immigrants themselves. They're too small a number to affect these things. So Britain, Britain provides an interesting test case. This is a map showing where people support UKIP, the UK Independence Party. It's very, almost single issue, well, double issue anti-Europe and anti-immigration party. I was debating whether to show this map or to show a map showing how people voted in the Brexit referendum, for which opposition to immigration was the #1 motive for voting. And then I realized they're almost identical maps. So it's very similar. So this is where people vote for UKIP. And let me show you where immigrants live in Britain. Born abroad, and if you flip back and forth, it's like one of those horror movie scenes where it flips from negative to positive, right? So that says okay, that's contact hypothesis. This is people who don't live among immigrants, voting against immigration. In Britain, the scholars in Britain are complicating this matter by pointing out some different effects. Let's look at a third map of Britain, really of England and Wales, if that's what this map is. They've decided that no one in the north part of Scotland is voting, but they don't vote for UKIP up there anyway. This is a different map of England. This is showing the change in the foreign-born share of the population. So the dark reddish colors are places where the foreign-born population has increased between 2005 and 2015, and the bluer places are where it's decreased. And as you can see, that's a very different map than where the most foreign-born people are. Places where there's been an increase look a lot more like the places where people are supporting UKIP. Not everywhere, but there's a number of places, like, it shows Boston there and Melton, where there's been a strong increase in the share of the foreign-born population, and those places voted strongly for UKIP. So there's what you might call the change hypothesis, which is places that didn't have any immigrants that suddenly see some more. The people there get edgy about that. The white people there get edgy about that, and they vote for anti-immigration politics. Now, there's a couple caveats with this approach. I mean, this is basically the hypothesis of Matthew Goodwin in his very interesting new book on national populism. He's a British scholar who analyzes these things, and he believes in this change hypothesis, that people who've experienced a little bit of immigration change, they flip, they turn anti-immigration. A couple caveats on that, though. First of all, there's a statistical risk in this that measuring percentage change tends to favor places with this very low baseline, right? If your community had 6 immigrants and now it has 18 immigrants, you're going to have a vastly larger percentage change than if you had 10,000 immigrants and now you have 12,000 immigrants, even though the number coming in is different. And there are some of those effects. There's some places on that map that still don't have many immigrants at all. But because of that statistical effect, it's a lot. Second of all, your timeline. This is all shaped by your timeline. If you're measuring this over a 50-year timeline, it's going to look very different, and so on. And what are you saying about that? I mean, one way to read this theory is to say that, okay, people get used to diversity. So in the early years, people are frightened. They see, somebody with a headscarf or somebody speaking Spanish in their neighborhood, and they vote for intolerant parties. But then after a few years, the contact hypothesis kicks in, and they start voting differently. But there's other ways to read that as well, and there's not enough analysis over what time period we're looking at. But there's another problem with that is the question of whether that change, whether those political outcomes are measuring change in foreign-born population, or are we talking about visible minorities? Are we talking about because I'm pretty sure that the percentage change in population that's causing people to think they want to vote UKIP, if any change in population it's not people from France or the Netherlands in West Lancashire that's causing that. It's an increase in brown-skinned people and black people in these neighborhoods. To the extent that that's a psychology. And of course, that would not be affected by Brexit. But let me say that I think another way to read this is to say these people aren't looking at any actual immigration that's going on. They're looking at mythologies about the people around them. Maybe when they visit London, they see some people with headscarves and they think, okay, this is a majority. And let me show you one final map that illustrates that. This is a map of Europe showing a pie chart for each country. That the big orange slice is how many Muslims people in those countries think live there. The little red, dark red slice is how many actually live there. So in Britain, the British people think 21, a quarter, a fifth of their country is Muslim. In fact, it's 1 out of 20, it's 5%, and so on. You can do this map with not just Muslims, you can do this with refugees or immigrants or so on. In fact, if you do it with refugees, it's even more dramatic. People seem to think that half the country are refugees, and it's generally sort of 5 to 7% or something like that. And I think that points to a different explanation for these voting patterns, which is not a response to any actual immigration that's occurring in your community or even in your country, but about images and mythologies based on partly on things you see and partly things in the media and these political parties that give rise to people voting for parties of intolerance. So, and I will pass this on to my colleagues who could get into some better detail in local and more specific places.